Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, as Rob said, I'm Jan, and this is work done with another student of mine, Roseanne Steno, another student at Stanford with me, Roseanne Steno. It's also a PhD student, and what it is it's a study looking at interruptions on software teams. So to give you kind of a broader frame for that, for most of us who work in collaborative knowledge work or work with other people, interruptions are pretty much a fact of life. Anyone working collaboratively has some need to coordinate action or share information with other people, and what that means is that we're going to have to interrupt each other at some point in order to get that done. The study I'm going to talk about today takes a really in-depth look at interruption occurrence and incidents on two software development teams. One that works almost exclusively in pairs due to their use of the XP, extreme programming methodology, and one where the programmers work in the more traditional way, working alone. It's pretty in-depth, so I'm sure by the end you're going to be really sick of interruptions and how they occur. But if you'll bear with me, hopefully it'll be worth it. So a really, really brief review of extant work on the field. There's a couple studies out there that look at knowledge work, that look at interruptions. There's a lot of work on interruptions, and they've kind of established that collaborative work is complex and fragmented, so we can't think of it as a linear activity. You just do your task, done, move on to the next. People switch tasks a lot. People move between different tasks. Interruptions are a crucial part of knowledge work, that you need that to get information from other people on the team, but a lot of studies have established that they're actually stressful for workers. So you'll have people reporting high levels of stress, frustration, reduced productivity, and anxiety because of the level of interruption that they experience in the course of work. And one thing these studies all really look at, and one way that our study is a little bit different, is that they've all looked at workers working alone and interrupted while engaging in independent work. So that way, that's something really different here, is that we're looking at both people working alone, working by themselves, and people that are working in pairs, which no one's ever really taken a deep look at. So in terms of framing the study, the research questions that we had when we went into looking at this slice of a larger ethnographic study is, one, how do interruptions affect knowledge workers that are configured in pairs rather than working individually? Hey, what difference does that make? It's an opportunity for us to take a look at what pair programming looks like in the real world in situ. And how can this understanding of interruptions in paired work inform the design of work tools? So not only work tools to support paired work, but also how is it going to come back and change the way that solo developers work? How can we build things that will better support solo developers using what we've learned about paired work and interruptions? So that's the goal. It's kind of the goal that we went in with. So to tell you a little bit about where we looked, the research site is two product development teams at the same mid-sized startup company in Silicon Valley. It's a really small company. Team Pair, so we did ethnographic observations there. From Team Pair, we were there from May to August of 2005. From Team Solo, we were there from August to December of 2004. We actually had 3 more months with Team Pair, but that data wasn't included here for a reason I'll talk about in a second. We followed both teams through planning, design, implementation, and product release. So a complete product cycle to lessen the chance that what we are seeing is behavior associated with just a particular phase of the project. So we saw the whole thing. To tell you a bit about each team, Team Pair did pair programming, again, as a part of extreme programming, XP. They worked in a large, open, bullpen-like space with visual and oral access to their teammates, and I'll show you a picture of that in a second to get a sense of that, because most people haven't worked in this environment. These programmers really frequently consulted with each other through face-to-face communication. That's kind of their primary means of talking to each other, was walking over and starting a conversation. They had very limited email use, primarily to talk to people outside of the team within the same company, because the rest of the company used email a lot. And they used telephone, but almost exclusively for personal calls. So people would call them, they'd answer that, but not for talking to other members of the team, mostly because everyone was always in the same space day to day, so they didn't have a need for those technologies. Similarly, virtually all the work on this team was done on site. So there's no working from home, there's no remote work here. Everyone comes to the office at about the same time every day, works in the same place, and then they leave at the end of the day. So here's kind of a photo of that. It's not a great photo. that space, you can see it's a small team. I think at their height during observations they had 12 people, but you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and sometimes they had a 6-station set up there with 2 monitors each. Each of those are onto a shared computer. Each one had 2 keyboards and 2 mice that they could operate, not at the same time, but they could alternate use, and that was very fluid. They could just jump in anytime to go ahead and take that other keyboard from someone. And you can see they can see everyone, and they're sitting close enough to each other that they can pretty much hear everything that's going on. Okay, Team Solo, there's no picture for them because they look like kind of your typical software development setup. They work in individual cubicles clustered together, so if everyone on the same team has cubicles in the same area of the office. For communication, they used a much wider range of technologies or mechanisms. Face-to-face communication for when people were in the office, they would walk over and say, ask a question. They used email a lot, and they used what's called Lily. It's a computer-mediated communication tool coming out of RPI, or Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And what it is, it's kind of a big text-based chat room. Chat rooms are text-based. So it's kind of a big, they have windows open, you can log in, you can subscribe to different chat lines, which they had organized by, for instance, functional groups in the company, your work team. There's one called Water Cooler for, all sorts of random talk. Some were more topical in nature, and what that was just a big window that they kept open on their machines, and as people talked to these lines, sent messages to these lines, it would scroll up on that screen. You also had the ability to send personal messages to each other on Lily. The team was avid Lily users. Usage was pretty high among the company. I'd say almost everyone used it except the XP team, who did not use it at all. Or Team Paired, who did not use it at all, but these guys were actually pretty hardcore about it. Almost all the team members logged in whenever they were at work, for sure, so that they could be available via Lily to everyone else on the team. But like most people, I'd say, about 40% of them actually were on Lily anytime they were in front of a networked computer. So they would log on first thing in the morning when they woke up, before they got to work. They would log on at work, they would go home from work, they would log on again, and they would log off right before they went back to sleep. They'd be there on weekends, so they were almost accessible anytime they were near a computer. They were on Lily. So that's kind of the extent to which Lily use was pervasive in this team. For telephones, they used that to call into meetings. Otherwise, throughout the day, it was primarily for personal use. They didn't really call each other to talk to each other. And the team members on this team, it was actually partially geographically distributed. They had 1 or 2 members that were in different parts of the country. It kind of varied depending on what phase of the project they were in. And the team members regularly worked from home. Part of that is because they had these technologies that made it possible for them to do that because of their partial distribution. So usually 1 or 2 days a week, they just went home and worked from home the whole day. Okay, methodology. We did weekly visits, sometimes bi-weekly. Each time we spent 3 to 5 hours with the developers, which is, I think, a luxury of academia. But we sat behind the developer or the pair of developers, and we took really extensive notes of their actions and the context in which these actions occur, so whatever else that was going on around them that affected what they were doing. We brought along an audio recorder to capture dialogue and sounds, although not for the first 3 months, which is why we can't use that data. That was transcribed, integrated with our notes. We generated very detailed transcripts of what was going on in each one. They range about 40 pages each. So that's just like a ton of stuff from each one of these visits. And for this particular study, what I then did was go through each one of those transcripts and identified interruption instances. Talk a little bit about what that is next. We recorded for each of these interruption instances information, such as how long the interruption occurred, took, how did it occur, who started it, why did it start, and then we tried to categorize those interruptions based on these characteristics to draw some more general statements about them. So, an interruption instance we defined as any instance in which the workers turned away from their primary work task, either on their own or in reaction to the actions of others. And the way we established what their primary work task was that each day when we started an interruption, we just asked. We said, what are you working on today? And they would tell us what they thought was kind of their main goal, main task. And if that ended and they changed to a new task, they usually told us. They said, okay, now I'm going to work on X. And so that's what we used in our analysis as primary work tasks. So when they started working on something else and they didn't tell us, then we'd say, okay, well, this is a secondary task. This isn't really your primary goal for today. And we had about 40 hours of usable observation data, culled from all those observations. About 22 of them for 22 hours on team pair, 18 hours on team solo. And here, during that, we saw 242 interruptions. 138 of them were on team pair, and 104 of them were on team solo, so roughly equivalent numbers on the two. What we did was we drew in a taxonomy by two researchers at the University of Texas called Jett and George that categorized interruptions as either intrusions, distractions, or breaks. And then what we also looked at is whether they were self or externally initiated. And so I'll talk a little bit about each of those in turn. So this is just a framing for what I'm going to talk about next. We found that the interruptions differed across the two teams by length, content, type, and time of occurrence. The programmers on the two teams differed in strategies and practice when they were the interrupter, the person who goes to interrupt the other programmer, versus the interruptee, the person who's being interrupted. And that self-initiated interruptions differed strongly across teams. And that last point I think is particularly interesting, so I'll get to that later and talk about why. So here's kind of the numbers. Interruption length. The interruptions on team pair were consistently shorter than team solo, regardless of the type and source. This isn't a great table, so I tried to put some color in there to make it a little bit easier to understand. So what you see is for team pair, our total observation time, 21 hours and 41 minutes. Team solo, 18 hours and 29 minutes. The average length of an interruption on the pair team was 1 minute and 55 seconds. It's across 138 of them. Team solo, 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That's across 104 of them. So you see there are about 50 seconds difference between the two categories. To break that down a little, again, team pairs are briefer in every category. Self-initiated is a huge one. It's 2 minutes and 16 seconds on team pair across 50 interruptions. 3 minutes and 38 seconds on team solo. It's about a minute and 15 seconds difference in that time. Externally initiated, I could go down, but basically in every single one the pairs are much shorter, and then the notable ones are ranging between 30 seconds to about a minute and a half, and then the break. Self-initiated interruptions and the breaks are the ones where you see that big difference between the two teams. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is so, like structurally and socially. Okay, so then on. So how did we categorize each one? These are the definitions from the Jett and George paper. Intrusion, they define to be an unexpected encounter initiated by another person that interrupts the flow and continuity of an individual's work and brings that work to a temporary halt. So whenever someone else, some external thing stops you, usually another person. Okay, so team pairs intrusion. Here's kind of a sample transcript from one of them. To intrusions initiated by their team members on this team were primarily functional in nature, so someone coming in to ask you information that they need for a task, like hello. I had to obfuscate the tech stuff in this sample for the company to let me use it, so which is why it might not make too much sense as you're reading through it. I tried to make it a little more generic. But this is kind of a classic intrusion. What's happening here is that Ben and Carlos is a pair that's working together, and Dana is another developer working in a different pair, and she's just going to turn and ask them a question. They don't even leave their seats often to do this, so they're just sitting around, and they say, hey, did you guys stop with the locks? This is a task that they had been working on before. They start discussing it. They kind of pick up on what they were doing before. And in the middle of this, other team members will frequently join in because they're in the small room, conversations going across people. And so here we see Andy and Eric, two other developers who weren't a part of the original interruption, just come in and join the discussion as it's going on. That happened quite a lot, so they vary greatly in both length and scope in terms of who's involved with the interruptions. Some of the intrusions on this team were purely social in nature, but those are really short and a little rarer. Social interruptions tended to be 2 or 3 line conversations here. Someone will make a joke, and they'll laugh, and then they'll go right back to work. Or often what happened is they'll start having a social conversation, and someone will go, guys, we got to get back to work. And so those tended to be short, and they kind of clamped down on that across the team. And then finally, the largest, or the second largest source of intrusions on this team was probably their cell phones, because everyone had cell phones and they got calls throughout the day. They would almost always answer them, and then they'd leave the work area in order to answer the phone, have that conversation, and then come back. So Team Solo's intrusions looked very different, and this is actually a really long example that cuts across 2 pages. I'll walk through it. The intrusions tended to be a mix of both functional and social. So in here, this one what you'll see is they'll come in, and they're making jokes, they're teasing. So Feroz and Henry show up at Grant's cubicle. So Grant is the developer I'm observing during this during this session, and they come up, and he's handed out these like gag memo pads that he's gotten from a conference, and they're like IP protocol pads, and so each of the pad has like fields for each of the IP protocol fields. And, they're teasing him about it, making jokes, just very social stuff. And at some point at the very bottom through this conversation, and this isn't edited actually, Henry just says this, he just changes right into a question about work. He says, hey, should I check in the code to work with the scanning stuff? And so what's going to happen is that launches a conversation about the release that they're going to do on Wednesday, right, and talking about their product on different platforms and whether it's, what the status is right now. And then drawn in by the sound of this conversation, another developer appears, Ingrid, and she shows up at the cubicle entrance and then immediately turns the conversation back to social. She's giving some office gossip. In this case, what happened is she bought a caramel tart but dropped it on the ground, and then she put it in the kitchenette anyway. And she sent a message to everyone on Lily that don't eat the tart, it's on the ground. But the XP team pair's not on Lily, so they didn't know. So she comes in and sees them, and they're just eating this tart. And so she comes over to tell them about that. So, which is why. So again, here you see this big mix of social and functional. They're longer. They tend to be meandering. They involve some form of movement. Like people usually go to another person's cubicle and talk to them for a little while. And then other than that, there are other big source of intrusions are phone calls, personal phone calls that they receive throughout the day. They usually stay in their workspace when they answer those calls, which is a little odd because even though they're in their cubicles, you can hear conversation very clearly across the cubicles, but for some reason they don't seem to really think about that. They still answer the phones right in the cubicles, but that's kind of the look of intrusions on these two teams. So distractions. Jet and George describe this as a psychological reaction triggered by external stimuli or secondary activities that interrupt focused concentration on a primary task. So often noises in the environment or something visual in the environment. And the way we detected these in our observations is when they paused. We usually noted that when we were watching them. And often they would reorient toward the stimuli. They would turn their heads towards the source of the sound. One second. Or they'd make a comment about that. What's that noise? That's really annoying. Yes?
People were talking on the phone. Were these people having headphones on so that they would not get distracted as much?
No, that was rare. They actually just listened. You could tell because they would usually make comments about it later. Like at lunch, they'd be like, "Oh, heard you talking about X." So, but they still kept going.
They weren't using headphones, right?
No, rarely. I saw a couple developers with headphones in their cubes, but I never saw them use it. So I think they had them with the intent to use. So distractions on team pair, because they're in the middle of this environment that has so much cross-conversation, that peripheral conversation is a huge source of distractions for them. You saw that already in the intrusion where you saw two other developers get distracted and drawn into the conversation. Most of them are faster, quicker incidences. Like here, Levi is talking to Kevin, another developer, and they're talking about a bug in the application. They said one of the dialog boxes is too small, so it's cropping the error message that shows up. And Eric and Nathan, who are working next to them, just stop and listen and then start making comments about it. In this case, it doesn't stick. It's really fast. And so, 10 seconds later, he turns back to his work. Nathan listens for a little bit longer, but that's kind of the length of their distractions on that team. But that happened quite a lot because of the noisy environment that they were in. In general, they filtered out conversation pretty well, or they kept those distractions at a minimum. What really bugged them was irregular noise. Like if you come in and you start rustling papers or like wrappers, they get really annoyed at you and they start looking at you until you stop, which makes sense, right? You learn to work in this work environment and you get used to the constant buzz of conversation, but if there's something irregular, that's really disruptive to their thinking and their work. And then the other thing is that physical objects in the work environment are a source of distraction. This is not like a huge insight. In fact, they made use of this quite a lot. They had several visual displays in that shared work area that deliberately would, they had a build monitor running that showed the status of all. They had 4 automated builds that ran on different systems under different configurations, and it would flash red or green depending on the status of the build, and that was deliberate to draw people's attention to problems with their process. So in this case, Eric sees the build monitor flashing and says, hey, is anyone fixing the build? Yes?
As observers, how often were you distractions?
To them, we excluded from here any time that we were an obvious source of distraction. But actually, in the pairs section, not really, because they're already in this room, they're already talking to each other, so there's very little that we really need to do as observers. We're just there capturing what they do. We didn't actually have to ask that many questions because you could hear what they were talking about and what they were thinking about in that environment. So most of the time we just sat behind them rather quietly. But yeah, anytime we did do that, though, we took that out of the set, so that's not in here. The solo side were probably a little bit more intrusive because they're not used to having someone sit in the cube with them. But the way we kind of got around that is that we spent 2 or 3 sessions with each developer. And so usually they kind of got used to us after a while. People got pretty good at ignoring us when they really needed to do work because we encouraged them. It's like, if we're in your way, just ignore us. And so, like, for instance, we noticed there's a difference. The first time you sit with a developer, they're, like, startlingly on task the whole time. Like, they never goof off. But, like, by time 3, they're, like, watching videos, and they're like, hey, check out this, like, comic that someone sent me. So it's a little more representative, I think, of what's going on. Okay, so finally, breaks. What did I talk about? Oh, yeah. So team solo, the distractions are similar. It's conversation, irregular noises. One thing that really differs on that team is that the Lily chat window is a big source of distractions for there. Whenever chat activity starts to show up, you see people stop and look at that to read. Usually that's a really quick check to see if there's anything they need to look at or pay attention to, and then they go back to work, although sometimes it triggers them into a longer, more extended interruption, and we'll talk about that under self-initiated interruptions. Yeah?
Is there a reason why team pair didn't engage Lily?
The two of them are, well, you're working in pairs and you're focused on your task, and so they just didn't really feel a need to. I mean, they didn't even check their email throughout the day, which was actually kind of frustrating for the rest of the company because they would try to send out, like, announcements. Like, I mean, I saw an instance where they sent out this announcement that was like, someone's blocked me in, right? Someone's double parked, and they're blocking someone who needs to leave, and the pair team just never ever got the message. Eventually they had to, like, walk into the pair area and say, like, who's got, like, a black Honda Civic, because it's blocking everyone. So they just, I mean, they were very focused on what they were doing, and they just didn't feel this need to check their email or even do Lily. Yeah?
Was there a difference between the distractions that they got from email versus the distractions they got from Lily?
Different.
Or was Lily just more distractions?
They were different types because Lily tended to be more social. Right, email, you tend to send people email, work-related email that's like, hey, there's a bug here, can you look at it? Or I just fixed this, or a lot of times it was automatic notifications, so they'd get check-in mails and they'd say, like, oh, someone's checked in a bunch of code, I should look it over. Lily, you got the whole gamut. Like, people would be like, I just saw Lord of the Rings this weekend, it was awesome, versus, or, support really needs us to answer this question about X. So, different in the sense that the content was different. But mode of delivery, not so much. Other than Lily was always open. They had to usually explicitly, they didn't keep their emails up. They would go and check email.
Did they have email notifications, like a new email?
Some of them did, some of them did not. They checked regularly enough that it didn't seem to make much of a difference. Yeah?
I wonder about the classification of the build monitor as a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing continuous integration and the build breaks, then one would think that was part of the core task.
Yeah, but in the frame of how we're looking at interruptions, right, in terms of how they come to the person being interrupted, right, it's not an intrusion because it's not someone coming to you. It's not a break because you're not stopping. It's something in the environment draws your attention. So in that sense, it's categorized. You're probably thinking of is in the sense of distraction has that overtone of being something that's not important, right? Whereas the build monitor is actually quite important for them to monitor. And so we're not using distractions in that sense. We're using distractions in the sense that it just draws your attention. So, any other questions?
Well, to be clear, it sounds like you don't actually mean a positive or a negative
Yeah.
on any of these.
Yes.
Because actually even the other classifications have the potential to be valuable to the individuals or the
Yes.
teams. They just stop you from working on the flow.
They're just descriptive terms. That's why I give a definition each
So there are
time.
negative connotations to one or the other.
We're sort of neutral at this point about them.
That's good.
Yeah. I saw another hand. Yes.
Were the teams working on similar applications? And if so, what type of applications were there?
One of them was working on a user-facing Java application that integrated the company's back-end products to be managed. I'm trying to say it without giving away too much information about it. But it was pretty complicated. They had to work pretty closely with the server-side stuff that was done on Unix and Linux. And so in some sense, they were pretty closely tied together, although they did a lot more UI stuff.
Was that solo or pair?
That's team pair. And they're also, I mean, they're not meant for like John Doe user. It's meant for administrators who are configuring networks and need pretty detailed configuration options. And so it's not like, you're not making things for your sister or your mom or, the general public. Team Solo was built a whole set of different like server stuff, that people could use to do network configuration. So different languages, different platforms, there was some overlap there, but they're reasonably tightly tied in terms of what they had to know. Yeah.
What was the level of experience? Was it pretty comparable as far as the programmers go? I mean, was there more high-level programmers on one team versus the other?
Team Solo had, well, they both had a couple people that were really considered the gurus. Like, you'd ask anyone, and they'd be like, that guy, he knows everything about the project. He's the expert. He's the guy we're going to go to. And a bunch of new people. So they both had a spread. They were configured a little bit differently. But in terms of the range of expertise you had on the two sides, I would say that Team Solo's programmers had been with the company longer. And so they had more expertise with that product. But they also had new programmers who had just been there for, 6 to 10 months. Team Pair was a newer project. It had only been, I think, 2 years old at that point versus the Solo. I mean, they worked on, it's a startup company, so they have like 5 products and everyone works on everything on the Solo side. The Pair side, they had been brought in specifically to do this one project, but that integrated across all the different Solo projects. So they were newer. I would say in terms of time, like programming work experience, probably if you average them out, it's roughly equal. I actually have that, I just never did that calculation. So, any other questions? Okay, did I talk about Team Solo's distractions? I think I did, right? Okay.
You know what you didn't do? I don't think you told us what Team Solo's development process was. Team Pair was using an extreme programming-ish process. What about Team Solo?
Waterfall-ish.
Okay.
Not strict.
Okay.
But basically, I mean, they said all sorts of things that they weren't really true. They were like, oh, we're kind of like Scrum. And it was like, no, you're not. Like, you don't actually do anything that's like Scrum related. You have a morning meeting, that's it. I was like, do that, Scrum. So it was, you had to pick it out yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so, oh yeah.
Could you go back to the slide of the, I'm curious about the number of self-interruptions, particularly for pair versus...
Okay. So Team Pair actually has more.
They're shorter.
But they're shorter. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit. I mean, do you have a question right now, or?
That seems one of the things about pair programming is because you have somebody sitting next to you, you're less likely to go watch that video on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
But then you said, I'm also wondering if having an observer there would kind of bias Team Solo, as you said, to be super productive. And even after 3 sessions, they still might not be in their true solo behavior.
I watched several Star Trek videos, so I don't know. I was like this girl. I didn't tell him I knew CS stuff, and I dressed nice, and yet I was still dragged into the Leonard Nimoy, Bilbo Baggins video fest. So I think that is how self-aware they are.
Actually, I have a question for you on that. Are you assuming that because there's more interactions on Team Pair that they will? Because I read that as I see more interruptions on Team Pair that were self-initiated as a result of more.
Well, I would think that a solo person is more, and therefore the less the pair would move back to that work.
Well, you know what? I'm about to walk through breaks, so why don't we go that? And if you still have a question.
Let me ask you a quick question on that grid while you're still there.
Okay.
You were talking about Lily and email being big distractions for Team Solo.
Mm-hmm.
However, the externally initiated distractions on Team Pair is higher in count. What is the nature of their...
No. Those are all externally initiated interruptions.
Okay, interruptions.
So that includes people coming over to talk to you.
So the nature of their interruptions was people coming over?
Yeah, you can see that in the numbers, right? They have 94 intrusions versus, so that's probably confusing here. This is all the interruptions split into 3 categories.
Gotcha.
And this is all the interruptions split into 2 categories. Sorry, I told you it was a bad team.
No,
Suggestions would be great on how to format this one better.
Well, okay, so here's some suggestions then. It would be interesting to see approximately how many distractions per hour on that table.
Mm-hmm.
And you might actually, I mean, are all intrusions externally, let's see. All intrusions, distractions, and breaks. Okay, so all your breaks would be self-initiated. All your intrusions would be externally initiated. What about distractions?
They're kind of in between.
Okay.
So, I mean, what's the thing is, you use these categories analytically, but when you actually look at the data, things are really messy, right? This is what happens anytime you do ethnographic work. Because so you have a bunch of stuff that's like really clearly an intrusion, really clearly a distraction. Then you have a bunch of stuff that's like halfway in between. It's like, what do you do for one? What do you do for the other? And so what we did was tried to very consistently go through and make those decisions about sorting each ones. But if you actually look at the data, right, it's not clearly in 3 buckets. It's more of a continuum across each.
Okay, now I'm seeing there's a higher count of intrusions than there are externally initiated.
Interruption.
What is a self-initiated intrusion?
A self-initiated intrusion.
There's only 88 externally initiated interruptions, and there's 94 intrusions.
Is this relevant, or can we get on?
Well, I'm trying to understand the nature of the data.
I can't think of it offhand, so
Okay.
why don't we wait? And if I'll try to either come up with something by the end of the talk, or you can send me email so we can move on. Okay, so breaks. We had planned or spontaneous recesses from work on a task that interrupts the task flow or continuity. So pretty straightforward definition of break when people stop working. On team pairs, these breaks are usually personal tasks or errands. They have to leave, go to the doctor. They'll take mental breaks. They'll go get a cup of coffee from the kitchenette. And they usually involve a physical absence from the workspace. In these cases, they'll walk out of the work area to do whatever it is and then come back. If they're in the workspace and taking a break, this was really rare. They're usually checking email really fast. I think maybe only saw 3 instances of this across the entire observation period, or surfing the web in the morning before things have kind of started. But pretty, so they kept these pretty quick. For solo, the breaks, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this under self-initiated interruptions. But what the breaks seem to do is they kind of, drew lots of people in, and they tend to spawn other types of interruptions. So here's our Leonard Nimoy Bilbo Baggins video. What's happening is someone's just in the middle of working, he stops to read Lily. He just stops in his task to check Lily because he sees something on there. And as he's reading it, he sees it's a link to a video on the web, and he decides to open it, and he types it into a web browser. It starts to play. Well, you can hear things across these cubicles, and so the sound of the music draws in Feroz and then later Grant to this cubicle to start watching this video with him. And then by the end, Grant's like, oh, wait, here's this other hilarious video that I heard of, let's watch that one. And so you can start to see why these things are getting much longer, and that difference between the two teams. To talk a little bit about interrupter strategies and interruptee strategies. Here, interrupter strategies, this is what you do when you're going to go interrupt someone. The people in team pair really tried to take advantage of the fact that they could see everyone to be good about interruptions. So they would try to watch. You saw people scanning the room to look for lulls in conversation when they could make an announcement, or if they're interrupting a particular person, they would wait for that person's conversation to die down before going over to ask a question. In some ways, that's kind of good and bad because they used a really rough metric, right? They basically used when conversation ends. So conversation was taken as a sign of active engagement in whatever task you were doing. Silence is taken as a good time to interrupt, but often for these programmers, silence meant they had made the decision on what to do and were turning to implement it now, and that's when people would come in and ask a question. So they tried to use this information. It's kind of questionable whether they used that really well, whether that really was a net benefit for them. And ultimately, even when they tried to be really accommodating about this, they were kind of fundamentally limited by this need for timely information. So you could only wait so long. Even if you were watching someone, you could see them working really hard. At some point, you need that information to move on in your task, so you're just going to go ahead and ask anyway. So that's something that's interesting here, is because a lot of the systems that we see built to support interruption handling talk about giving contextual information to the person who's going to interrupt. But here it's like, well, they have some form of contextual information, and they're not using it very well because they need that information in the end. Rob, did you have a question?
So if you had a potential interrupter who had multiple sources of information? Did you see them ranking based on the interruptibility of people? In other words, my colleague who really is the guru seems to be busy, so maybe I'll ask somebody who's not as good, or maybe I'll look on the document.
They did eventually, but it had to be a pretty sustained interruption. Like if it was the head, the boss, right, they would wait for him because they didn't want to necessarily interrupt him. But like everyone else on the team was pretty much interruptible wherever it was. And the other thing is, on the team solos, you see this, is that they didn't have that visual information, so they would just, when they walked over to someone else's cube, they just show up. Right, they have no idea what that guy's doing, and or girl, and they'll walk in and just ask their question. And even regardless of whether that person's hard at work or not, they'll just ask the question because they've already walked all the way over here, right? So the cost of them was so high that's like, well, I'm just going to go ahead and interrupt you. They had actually a little bit better information. They had Lily, which tells you when someone's online, it tells you when they're idle, and it lets you see when they've posted information to the chat channels. But they honestly didn't actually use that as an information source in order to consider interrupter availability. They only used it when, after they had walked over and someone wasn't there, right, to see how long it was that they might get an information. Like, has he been gone 10 minutes or has he only been gone for 30 seconds? When am I likely to see that? So that was really interesting because they have this source of information that can give them information about what they're doing, and they don't use it. They just go over. So that I found, yeah.
How long, for team pair, how long would they sit there and wait for the break?
Not very long, maybe 5 minutes tops. They just watch, and then they'd usually, because the other thing was often if two people were simply not working because they needed that information, then they felt it was more important to interrupt than to wait. So. Interruptee strategies. In team pair, because you're in this open room, you don't have very much control over intrusion timing, right? People call you over, and you have to respond. They're right there. They're physically in the room. It's hard to defer that when they're right there. So you have to respond pretty immediately. But they had a lot more control over the duration and how to end that interruption. So what they could do is, one, they would usually have one member of the pair continue to work through that interruption. Two, instead of having the interrupter walk over to the side of the interruptee, on team pair, the interrupted person walked over to the interrupters because they're in pairs. So you walk over to the other two people, you look at their computer to help them resolve their issue. What this means is that they can shut down that interruption pretty easily. Like when they feel like they need to get back to work, they just leave, and there's not a lot that the other guys can do about it, other than like trying to call you over again. And what they can do is they can watch what their pair is doing. So if their pair partner is just sitting there spinning their wheels, you'd see them look over, see their pair partner, and say, here's all I can tell you. Look at this. Ask me again if you need more information. Bam, they're out of there. They go back to work. On Team Solo, you don't see that because people come to your cubicle. What you do see is people desperately trying to work through interruptions that are going on around them. All they can do is try to signal that they're done. They'd like you to leave so that they can do work. And software developers, that doesn't often take on the first couple tries, especially when a lot of people are there. So they'll be talking at each other, and you'll see the person who originally had the interruption valiantly attempting to do their task in the middle of all this. And eventually people will get that idea and start to leave, but it's a really different, they just don't have control over that, right? It's the interrupter who decides when to go back to their cubicle, then they're done. I mean, they would usually get more and more blunt over time. People are like, well, I'd like to work now. It'd be really great if I could work. What they did do was they tried to minimize intrusions by just simply limiting their availability. So what they did was they would work from home. And one of the reasons they did, that we heard several developers cite, was that they could get work done. People weren't always coming in to ask them questions, because when they're working from home, all those questions come in through Lily. And since it's chat and it's asynchronous, you can let that sit for a little while before you have to respond to them, and you can wait and respond to a whole bunch of things in one session, so you have more control over when you do that response. Yes.
Is there anybody from home working from home?
No, I didn't want to go there. But I could see them whenever they talked on Lily when I was observing the other programmers. So that's one of the reasons I could tell that, for instance, when I was observing people, they weren't necessarily, whether or not they were kind of with their true behavior patterns. Like there was this one developer, I think he's called Froze here, where I was with him the first time and he just worked straight the whole time. But every time I was observing someone else, he was on Lily every 10 minutes, right? Always a message on there. And I was like, that's not what you did when I was there. Yeah?
They said that they got more work done at home. Was there any verification, or could you tell that they actually did get more work done at home, or been more
No. What I will say is that they worked all the time, kind of. They probably did less concentrated work at work, but then at 9 p.m. on a Friday night, you could get them to answer questions and look into bugs. So they were doing like dispersed spurts of work all over the place. Given their given their activity on Lily, I would guess that they were not nearly as focused at home as they'd like to think they were. But I did not go to someone's house to verify that. It's actually really hard to get people to let you do that. We tried it for another study. Yeah?
For Team Solo, how did one developer know whether another one was in the office or working from home?
So they had a morning meeting. Every morning, both teams did, and that was one way, like, you knew who was in because they were physically there, and you knew who called in. So right away, every morning, they knew who was going to be in the office and who wasn't. So, and they also saw attached messages from Lily, it's called. Whenever someone logs on, there's a message about it, and usually what they were really good about doing was keeping information about that. It has a little blurb that you can set, and people would say, like, coming to work, you know, or at work now. And so that was also a way they were actually pretty good at tracking when people were around. Yeah.
So in the team pair case, since nobody has to move and interrupt, it seems like there's an interruptee strategy where you could say, hang on, wait, give me 2 minutes to finish this, and I'll come over.
Yeah.
Did you see a lot of that?
We saw it every once in a while, but again, it's hard to do that when you can tell they're not doing anything because they need your information. So every once in a while, you did see someone really say, like, no, I got to finish this first. But it was really, really fast because those guys are just spinning their wheels and sitting around. And the whole team can see that. They can see that you're holding up that other pair. So, anything else? Yes?
What did you see as the cost of the context resumption once the interruption was over? How long did it take before these people actually got back to work?
I'll talk a little, well, I didn't have, since I don't have video data, it's a little hard for me to see that on the solo side, unless they say something when they start work, like it's, you know, when do you turn your head to start looking at the task again. So I didn't have that precise measurement, and I'm kind of bummed about it, because that was something that I was pretty interested in looking at after I started getting into interruption behavior. So I don't actually have that. I do have some more rougher qualitative stuff, and they're on the next 2 slides. So talking about initiated interruptions. So on team pair, the breaks are taken whenever a developer sees fit. Slightly more between tasks or when they have a lull in the task, like they're waiting for a build or something. But really not so much. They'll just kind of take it whenever. And it can be really abrupt. This is something that surprised me, although I don't have anything really to follow up on it. For like Dana and Eric here, they're talking and they're in the middle of designing this class or figuring out where to go. And then he'll just get up and walk out, 2 seconds after the last statement. And so it's just very abrupt. But I mean, one reason that might be okay is because those breaks are so short that they almost always come back quickly enough that it's not considered like really rude or bad form to do that. Almost always one thing you see is the developer continues working as a break occurs. And so that sounds, it looks a little weird when you watch it because, for instance, when they're waiting for a build, sometimes these builds takes between 3 to 5 minutes or even longer depending on what they're doing. And one guy will just sit there in front of the computer watching it, waiting for the precise moment for it to finish until you can check in. And this is something you never see on the solo side. They almost always do something else. And, well, I'll show you here is that sort of, I wouldn't say gets you in trouble, but it leads to these longer breaks, these longer interruption sessions. So on the solo side, it's really usually triggered by downtime in the work task or distractions like something else happening on the screen. Waiting for test runs, waiting for builds. I'm sure you guys all have experience with that. The longer downtimes will lead developers to assume a secondary task. They'll start doing something else, but once they do, it's really hard for them to switch between that first and second task. And they'll have a build window running in the background. They'll start working on another bug or documentation. That window covers the build window. They don't start to see it. They forget to check it. That leads to really long delays in when they go back to that first task. So here's kind of an example with Henry. What he's doing is he's finishing up fixing a bug, and he says, okay, now I'm just going to run the whole test suite, the R test, and see what else breaks, see if that fix is doing it. So he starts to run them. That's a 5-minute process. And as he does so, he starts to look at the Lily window. He gets a message from Feroz about a bug. So even though he says he doesn't want to look at it, he starts reading all the conversation on Lily to try to get up to speed on that bug. As he's doing so, he realizes there's something in email he wanted to check, so he goes to his email, starts writing an email to someone. In the middle of his email response, this is probably like 10 or 15 minutes after that test run was started, everyone else comes and is like, hey guys, let's go to lunch now. So he takes off for lunch. And so that test run, he never checks it again until well after he gets back from lunch. So you see something that 5-minute process. On the XP team, someone just like sat there and watched it and immediately done that. Here he gets so drawn into a secondary task that he doesn't come back to it for over an hour in this case. So.
It looks like it didn't even come back to the second and then tertiary tasks either.
Yeah, I mean, you saw people do that a lot. They were just kind of like fragmented, get distracted, drawn to things. I mean, breaks would trigger, self-initiated interruptions frequently triggered other ones. And so you saw these long sessions of people just getting drawn into other stuff, watching videos, checking emails, surfing the web, and then, oh, right, my build was running. Yeah.
So does that count as an hour and a half break?
No, it counts as a set of small interruptions here. Okay, so why did interruptions differ? We kind of talked a little bit about this in your questions, but the kind of 4 broad postulates about why pair programmers may have felt a stronger sense of social obligation to their partners. Like anytime you have people working together closely, they tend to develop this sense of mutual obligation. And I think that's really at work here, where people shorten their own break times, shorten those interruptions, and shut them down so that they can get back to working for their partner and with their partner. Something that you were talking about over there, the pair partners seem to serve as a cue when people came back to their task. They make that interrupted task more salient. So when you come back from an intrusion, your partner's right there. He or she is working on that task. It's hard for you to get drawn into another task. It's hard for you to suddenly go and surf the web because they're right there and they're working on it. So it's immediate that you see that. Also, they might serve as a richer and more interactive means for them to recover state. Right? You don't have to reconstruct it all on your own based on what the application presents to you. You have someone that you can ask questions of, or more frequently what happens is the partner will automatically volunteer an update. Like, we're looking at this now, da-da-da-da, immediately drawing your attention to that part of the code, and then, bam, you're back into the task. You don't tend to like wander off into other tasks. Again, that's one aspect I would love to look at a little bit more closely with better data, but we didn't have video data. That one. Pair programmer actions were visible to the entire team, like both the interrupted pairs, their partner, and the larger team at large. Larger team at large. And so they had this immediate sense of accountability to the whole team that the solo programmers just didn't have because they were working in a more isolated space. And so this meant that, like, for instance, if you were holding up someone, right, you could see that in the context of the team effort. Like, you are holding up someone's work, you need that information. Or if you're interrupting someone, you can also see that more in the broader team context than if you're solo. And then pair work, one thing we thought was being social seemed to reduce the need for explicit social interaction. So again, those social interruptions are very short. They're constantly engaged in social interaction because they need to talk to people and interact with people as a matter of fact part of their work. That's how they get the job done when they're doing pair programming. So we saw very little of them walking over just to have social conversations. One thing that really supports this in this data is that the need for social interaction varies by person. And so in the pairs, it was very uniform. Everyone had fairly short, social numbers of social interruptions that they engaged in with other people. On the solo side, this varied greatly. Like, some people were constantly talking to other people, constantly talking on Lily, and some people really weren't. So this is some evidence that it seems like working in pairs really serves that need for them, and so reduces the need for you to go out and actually just start conversations outside of that. Okay, so some broader conclusions, mostly looking in terms of how we can use this for technologies and other tools to support both pair and solo work. One really thing that I've kind of been hitting throughout the presentation, that people really interrupt themselves, and that's something that hasn't always been considered when people design support for interruptive systems. They usually think of things as being an external intrusion, but here there's all sorts of ways in which people get drawn away from their task and then need help being brought back into that. So that's something that people should really consider when they're designing work systems. That having contextual information about the interrupter really seems to help the person being interrupted, right? So giving them easily processed, easily accessible, and ideally independent contextual information about why the person is coming to interrupt you can help you make a judgment of that relative urgency to what you're doing now and help you design some strategy for handling it, so to minimize the negative impact on you. So this seems to reduce some stress and some anxiety about the interruptions that occur. Information about ongoing tasks seems to help. So one thing the solo programmers seemed like they would really benefit from is some way to monitor the state of multiple tasks across at the same time. And this is tricky because those tasks span several applications, different types of systems, and so building into one application is not necessarily that helpful. You need a solution that cuts across several applications that can handle some generalized awareness across tasks. Giving interruptees control over interruption duration and end seem to help. So designing interactions that allow interruptees to end interruptions gracefully, or giving some mechanism, maybe technically, that allows them to leverage that. Like more obvious, like, okay, we need to help them send that signal. Like I want to get back to work now, and make that really clear. Seemed like that might have helped them. And also task salience and interactive cues ease task resumption. So how can we build that into an application? How can an application help you come back and remember where you were in the course of doing work to get you back to speed and thinking about that task? Okay, and then finally, looking at pair programming, it differs in some pretty important ways from solo programming, right? That the pairs reacted to interruptions very differently, and that pair work really seemed to attenuate some of the negative effects of interruptions. And so when we build tools and technologies, we usually have a solo programmer in mind, so we need to realize that when things happen in pairs, they don't react the same way, and that's something to consider when we're constructing these tools and technologies. And that's it. Questions, comments? Yes?
I was wondering, so Microsoft's thinking a lot about open space, but not necessarily pair programming. So we have solo programmers in an open space. So it seems like we get some of the benefits, like the awareness of what other people are doing and people are. So I'm wondering how much of the benefits, when you say the pair benefits, those are really the open space.
How much of it is an open space one? Yeah, we tried our best to tease them apart. So when I say pair, I think it's mostly a pair thing, and I tried to attribute to visibility and that, which is a function of that shared space when I could. But in this study, it's sort of fundamentally tied together, right? We have, because that's the nature of our site, pair programmers within an open space. So I'd love to get pair programmers in cubicles and see what they do, but
you did say that the solo people were in cubicles and not in offices behind closed doors.
Yes.
So there was at least a certain amount of overall social awareness that you can have.
Yes.
That's different than when you're behind an office.
Yeah. So you have more stuff when you're in an office. Like we did a look at part of another study. We looked at how people handled availability in offices, and like they use doors to signal when they want people to come in pretty effective ways. It's like open, come in, close, do not. And people in those studies waited a lot longer to interrupt. Like they would go 3 or 4 hours without getting whatever information they needed. They'd try to send email, but often it just wouldn't come back, or it would come back so delayed it wasn't useful. So that's one difference that you would have in an office environment versus this environment. Cubicles had no doors, so the default assumption is if you're in work, you're accessible, which is probably why we saw people go home regularly. Yeah?
Have you looked at the continuity of the differences between solo and pairs in terms of 3s or 4s or 5s? Or how long does it take before the solo dynamic starts coming back?
What do you mean by 3s or 4s?
I mean, have you looked at the relationship between pairs or 3s or 4s or 5s, whether there's similarity along those lines? How long, if so, how long does it take before...
Like triplets? Or before it turns into a small team?
Quadruplets?
We saw no triplets in the field. We did talk to a group of students that like to work as triplets, but they had a pretty set task breakdown. Like the pairs were 2 people in front of the computer talking it out. The triplets, they had 2 people from the computer talking it out and a third guy who was like the reference guy on a different computer, and that's what they call triplet programming. But I've never actually seen it in the professional programmers, so it's hard for me to say. I would guess based on the behavior of pairs, like pairs will get disengaged sometimes. We actually looked at another site where they only had 1 keyboard, and that seemed to make a pretty big difference in the level of engagement that people had, whether or not you could input at any given minute. They reported being a lot more disengaged. Well, a lot more. They made comments that indicated that they seemed to be more disengaged in the task. You tended to have one person more monopolizing the activity there. So it seems like if you have too many people and they can't have equal kind of access to the machine, then they start to get disengaged and then they start to act more like solo programmers. But I have no data to talk to that. Yeah.
So pair programming is typically described in terms of the driver and the navigator, that kind of thing. Did you make any observations about the navigators, about the relationship between self-interruptions and whether I'm the driver or the navigator?
We started to look at that, and what we really found was it was actually really hard to distinguish who was the navigator and who was the driver. when they had 2 keyboards, they were switching a lot, really fast, and so the distinction seemed a little meaningless. You didn't have one person sitting here going, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, and the other guy kind of reviewing it. It was very collaborative and back and forth.
So they weren't really doing driver navigation?
No, they weren't. Yeah. The single keyboard team was a little bit more like that. But we didn't look at interruptions for that. So yeah.
You mentioned that the different teams, the 2 teams were working on different types of applications. Something goes to the front end and something goes to the server side. Now, these would have very different dependencies, and other pieces of the application have very different dependencies on them. Do you have a feel on how those different dependencies would translate into the results that you have presented?
I don't know necessarily about dependencies. What I could say is that project structure seemed to have a difference. Maybe that's what you mean. How work was assigned. So the pairs switched, and they were sort of expertise agnostic in terms of how they assigned their tasks, right? So you'd ad hoc every morning, you'd form a pair, and you'd work on something. If the task lasts more than one day, then usually you had one person that had worked on it the day before, but you could be a UI guy, and I mean, they're all kind of generalists, right? You could be a UI guy, and you could be assigned to like doing, the XML processing part. Versus the solos had very, this was you worked on this part of the project. That's yours. You do it, until you check in. But everyone reviews everyone else's code. On the other hand, because it was a startup company, Team Solo's guys got switched around on projects a lot, and they split their task assignments a lot. Like they would hand things off if another project, a client had come in and asked for this sort of improvement. Well, they only have like 12 programmers, so someone's going to have to be taken off one task to do that, and someone has to take up the slack. So you saw a similar sort of shift. I was not allowed access to their code base, so I couldn't kind of get that any deeper, which is a shame. Maybe something you could do here. So it seemed like the dependencies could be roughly equated, but I really didn't have enough of a good look to say, whether I saw any big differences coming out of that. It didn't seem like it, because of the structure of the 2 teams. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Team Solo were involved in other projects.
Yeah.
Is that a source of the interruptions too?
In some sense. I mean, the startup company had 2 teams, and one of them was the pair team that was assigned to its project, and the other one was Solo, which handled everything else. And so the whole team handled everything else. So I don't know that they necessarily thought of them as this project team and my time is getting taken away for this other project, as much as like all of our developers are responsible for all of our products, and that's kind of part of the mix.
Sounds like the team pair was responsible for one project.
Mm-hmm.
Team Solo was responsible for N. So it seems like there might be more inherent interruptions.
I think the reason we didn't see that so much is because when we asked them to define their primary task, we didn't ask them which project it was on. I mean, we could tell from what it was, right? So they would have different tasks for different projects each day, but for that day, for like 3 hours, they were like, I'm working on this for this project. So that's why it doesn't come out in here. Yeah.
Did you find a relationship between these interruptions and productivity, or between the team pair and team solo in terms of their productivity?
I was not able to get a productivity measure. They wouldn't let me near their code. So at least in terms of lines, all I had was anecdotal evidence where the leads told us that, or the VP told us that the pair team produced code at a phenomenal rate. They were like something that we've just never seen anything like this before. That they just work so.
It was all new code.
It was. By the time of our second observation, they were actually going back and making modifications to the existing code because it had been their second version release, and so it wasn't all new code. The first time it was almost all new code, but they did say either way they just made changes and produced code at a phenomenal rate relative. But I don't have anything quantitative to show you other than that statement. Yeah.
You talked a lot about within-team interruptions.
Mm-hmm.
What about interruptions from outside the team?
We didn't see that so much because Team Pair was very isolated. Since they weren't on Lily, they didn't have connection to the rest of the company. Basically, all interruptions from the rest of the company came through their lead, who would then stand up and announce it. So it took the form of a within-team interruption on that side. On the solo side, the whole company was on Lily, so they'd come in through Lily sometimes, and you'd have people show up. I didn't make a particular effort to distinguish between that because there were so few that came from external sources that it didn't seem worth it, basically. Yeah, Rob?
So you said with both of them, you got to observe them for many different phases of development.
Uh-huh.
So did you see any interesting differences in interruption behavior in the different phases?
Before release, people showed up more on the solo side at your door. We saw that. So there was, I don't want to say that the pace of interruption, but it was highly dependent on who it was. So yes, but the data set might be too small to really pull that out. There were a couple, I think there was twice where both teams were waiting for one person/one pair to check something in so they could hand the product off. And in that case, yeah, you saw people showing up all the time that was like, what's up? What's the deal? Is it ready yet? But that was sort of one case. You didn't see it so much. It wasn't an extended pattern. So again, it might have been there, but we didn't have enough to really look carefully at that. Yeah.
So the common argument in favor of private offices is the concept of flow, and it takes time to get in for the flow, and very easy to knock out. In this study, did you see any evidence of that phenomenon? Did it help? How long did it take people to get back into flow? Did it matter?
Flow is interesting. It's kind of a weirdly defined concept, right? There's no real way to say, like, when is someone in a flow. From watching people interrupt themselves so often, right? I mean, that's why when I read the flow stuff, I think, like, this isn't really how I see solo developers work. And so that was a little strange to me. And then in the pairs, there just wasn't that sense at all of a ramp up. Like, they were, like, within a couple seconds, they would just come back immediately, be running ahead at full speed. And so that's why it made me a little more skeptical about the flow stuff, I'll say. Like, especially because people seriously would all the time just stop in the course of work and then pick it back up. So it really didn't seem like there was this 15-minute, 20-minute lead time you needed before you got really productive. Yeah.
Did you see any animosity form between the two teams, or being the soloists and the pair guys, because the pair guys were so isolated and detached in their own little world?
Yes.
How was that perceived?
The solo guys thought the pair guys were dumb. The parallel guys thought the solo guys were dumb. So that's kind of how that one worked out. But yet, I mean, it's a startup company, right? So it's a pretty small place, even if they're relatively isolated towards that. They have to work pretty closely, and it's their best interest to help the other guy go along. So despite this, they would actually be very helpful when someone came to ask you questions.
It seems like eventually that can't be tenable long term, and that those two, they're going to have to choose one side or the other.
I think the solo guys basically saw the pair team as needing to prove themselves because they were the new team. Like, the solo guys were there longer. And so when an established product went out, then they would make their judgment, is kind of how it seemed like it was going to go. So, yeah. Why was the company set up like that? Because the first time they tried to do the pairs teams project, it was a huge disaster. Actually spent a year and a half developing for that and scrapped the whole thing. And so they said, maybe we need something else. And someone said, well, why don't you try this XP thing? And so they came in. Actually, they kind of tried Scrum first, but like management hated it, so they kind of like hijacked the whole thing, which is why they think they're doing Scrum, but it's not. But then they brought in this actual team specifically to do XP with different people, and then they really stuck with it on this one. So that's why you ended up with that weird one, because they were, at this point, willing to try anything that would sort of tame that particular project's development process. They did know each other, and that's one reason it was hard. Like, people usually ask me personality questions about these systems, and it's hard to really say in this sense because the pair teams were like specialists in XP. It's a small pool of programmers that really like XP and really know a lot about it and want to evangelize it. So they did know each other, and they brought in a few new people that didn't so much. They kind of like tried to convert, is what they say. It really seemed like a kind of a cult thing, bringing them in. But they did know each other, and they had worked together before. So, yeah. Again, I couldn't see the code, so it's hard for me to make that judgment. And I'm just watching them code from behind them. So even though I can see the functions, it's hard for me to be like, oh, well, that's obviously a bug. Your relational database doesn't work like that at all. Like, no, I don't know. What I did see is that what I did pick up is over time the XP team seemed to think that their code base was messier, because they were going so fast, and the way they had structured it was so much was going on that they kind of lost control of how it was structured overall. But I think that's more of an XP thing. You can talk about that a little bit more if you like. I think it's a result of the way they switch pairs every single time, so they kind of get a lossier and lossier concept of what code is supposed to be, whatever task is supposed to be over time, versus the waterfall guys have one person, and then when they check in, everyone on the team reads that check-in, so they actually knew they had a pretty high fidelity impression of what that project code should look like, and they were able to keep it more cohesive technically. So, but I don't think that's a pair programming thing necessarily. Yeah.
To what extent did process maturity bias the results? If they brought in gurus with XP, did they have any equivalent gurus on the waterfall side?
No.
Did they have a central architect?
They did have a central architect. And the XP side, even though they weren't supposed to, sort of by the end of the project, they had one guy that was calling the shots on how that was. He told me, between you and me, don't put this in a paper, but I've basically become the central architect for this project, which is like totally anathema to like XP, credo. So he didn't want it published, but that's what ended up happening on that team in order to keep a lid on that project. Yeah.
Did you ask the developers to reflect on their interruptions or reveal any of your data recorded about their interruptions?
I have not yet done that. I sent a previous paper to it, but then they got really busy and switched management, so they kind of stopped caring about my papers when I sent it to them. But I didn't ask them explicitly. The XP guys did talk to me a little bit more about their work process in terms of they felt that they should be on target all the time at work, on task every time. And the waterfall guys made a couple comments, the team solo guys made a couple comments that were just like, well, it's okay for us to goof off a lot because we're working all the time. We work from home all the time, and that was sort of their mindset about it. And that seemed pretty universally shared across the team. So I didn't really ask them in-depth questions about that. Yes?
From the data collection and analysis perspective, most of the facts you present, right, is kind of intuitive. You can, looking at the social behavior of the people, you see that's easy to explain. Do you find anything counterintuitive or paradoxical when looking at the data, how interaction happens?
I thought the fact that the pairs had shorter interruptions were actually pretty counterintuitive when I initially encountered it. I thought they're in this big environment, they have more of an opportunity to talk to people. It seems like, like you could imagine in a case where the teams just start goofing off a lot because everyone's right there. So that for me was actually counterintuitive to see that. And then looking into why the fact that where people walk back and forth, I thought it was pretty cool. More broadly, I have some other stuff, but not strictly related to this stuff that I thought was very counterintuitive. Mostly the code base getting messier, and that information on the XP team seemed lossier. Like everyone knew it right away when you said something, but 2 weeks later they'd forget what design discussion had gone into a particular decision, and you'd hear people asking about it because they couldn't remember. Whereas on the waterfall side, that stuff was much more recorded. It was with the same person, so they knew that. And I thought that was a little counterintuitive, but that's not part of this particular work. Yeah?
So you said they worked all the time. How did the XP team work at home? How did the pair?
Team solo worked all the time. Yeah, the XP team did not. XP team came in the morning, worked until, they stayed a little long right before release, until 7 or so, and they went home and they didn't work on it until they came back in the next day.
The management still had the impression they were more productive.
Yes. So, and I think that's what impressed them about it, is that they seem to be producing so much more code within a very compressed time frame. Yeah.
You mentioned the averages of the interruption times. Did you look at the statistical variance between the two, and was one larger in one group than the other?
No, I did not calculate that number, but I'll tell you that it in all likelihood, the variance is much, much higher on the solo side than the pair side. Just from that. I mean, you had people that would really have very long, 5 to 8 minute interruptions, and some people kept them all really short. So you saw a lot more of, I think, individual personality kind of being reflected that way. Like one of them, I think it's Grant, who was just very focused. I mean, you could prod him with a stick and he wouldn't really notice. He could filter you out. I told him to ignore me and he really did. It got to the point where I was like, okay, I take that back. You have to tell me what you're doing before you completely ignore me. But he was really able to just cut you out. And when he got interrupted, he never, he didn't do that same pattern that everyone else did. He came back. And then you had people that were really just kind of, I don't call them offenders, but they were just, serial sort of long social triggered, it takes a long time to come back. And then everyone else was kind of in between. And as a pair side, it was much more uniform. I cannot hear you, I'm sorry.
Cost is more predictable within the team condition because they knew the variance was shorter, so they knew they were going to be distracted from the work less. Did the users have that impression?
I don't think they really thought about their interruptions that much, to be honest. So yeah.
Before we totally run out of time, let's thank Jan for giving us a nice talk.